Hello and most welcome to 1111. And this lecture is dedicated the ones that are listening, and also the one and only of the Klein bottle, which shows that things can be absolutely different as anything is, inside and outside. I would say it doesn't really, in an everyday manner, it doesn't get any more different than inside and outside. I tried that yesterday. I didn't have much time, but I am in a society. I got the chance, mentioned to some people. What would you say if I suggest that inside and outside can actually, at some circumstances, at least logically and mathematically and physically, be the same thing? And they all asked, like an illusion or hallucination or something that you just see? No, actually, I said, just the opposite. Prove scientific fact. And the illusion is sometimes that inside and outside are completely apart, constantly. And this, I would say, is connected to the Heraclitean pantarai, the wish for movement, or the triangle movement, which can give pantainai. Stephen M Rosen, the author of the book Topologies of the Flesh, a multidimensional exploration of the life world, says that there is movement in stillness in this. This actually shows how movements happen in the universe. It takes two poles, the subject pole, which you can put here, and the object pole. One hint here is that this larger space, the canister or the container, as I usually refer to it, could be seen as a sort of space for an object, but not in that transcendental misgiving way, but actually how it is. And here you see the subject's perception coming down or being received. There is a perceiving thing of the canister, of the basin, going up to the subject. This is a bit difficult, so I will try to clarify. I just mentioned this has the following part: true phase of space, time, and knowledge. Very important. Knowledge could be the thing that we might have some problems with, but a hinter is Lakoff-Johnson and how they reveal that the most abstract things comes from space and time. Our body, those, so to speak, what we usually think to be the most transcendental things, are actually of the world. So I will try to make this clearer using illustrations from the book that are also to be found on the net. I will try to link these pictures up. I still don't know to 100% how one links the pictures, but I'll get them up there. So I think the best here would be Kalle following me up here. So when I do the drawing, you are, so to speak, monitoring at the same time. So you can see the whole thing in process. You can bring the whole camera maybe.
Okay.
Or is it clear enough, you think?
Yes, it should be clear now. Okay, no, okay.
Let's see here. You'll be the judge. So this is the drawing, and it's rather complicated. But here we have, I start like this, part uncontained. This is very important. That is the subject. So it goes down to the contained part, which is this contained as in container, vaguely resembling the old concept we often mentioned before, object in space in front of subject, but in a way completely different. This is truer space. This is how space is actually working. This goes down to the container. This is the bottom of the container, and here we have the container. But see here, it goes back to the subject. You can see the codependence here, so to speak, has reciprocally going back. It's a feedback, or it's even closer than feedback. It's a direct happening. And you can also see there is a complete difference. Undoubtedly, there is a complete difference, but there is also sameness. And in the group I approached, that could not be accepted. Not like counter-arguments, but I would say from an even stronger viewpoint that it was absolutely, completely impossible. If something is impossible, this is it. It was even this middle-aged woman, I think she was quite clever, said, I rather believe in trolls than believing that space and object can be the same thing, or container and contained could be the same thing. It defies something that is even stronger than logic. And this is why the revelations or the discoveries of topology, so well put into words by Stephen M Rosen, could be incredibly helpful in understanding a lot of things. I would thereby mention, for instance, Heraclitus, Heidegger. Heidegger, I came to know, was an inspiration for Stephen M Rosen, and I'm so glad I did not know that, just because the reason I did not know it made it even, his understanding even stronger. It didn't come in as a transferal or a translation of Heidegger or vice versa. I could keep them separated. And I think that is very important, because if we look into something like a book, an article, and preemptively we say, that's the same, or that is not the same, we block out. We have already by then constructed a sort of preemptive contradiction. I usually use this sign for that. This is rather weak. Into my pocket, never to reappear, hopefully. Yeah, this is better. We make the distinction too quickly, too early, so it's a two-factor. I would say it's a knowledge thing too, and we try, so to speak, take in everything at once from a very narrow perspective. We try to grasp everything. And this has actually connections with Ian McGilchrist, how he describes the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is impatient, and it always says, or believes, or try to understand everything at all, directly. All of the world in once. And it also has this flavor of one being able, at least potentially, to map map a complete world, little by little, and even if we sort of admit that not the whole world is mapped at the present, there is a potential possibility that the world will be mapped. And I call that the mapping of the world illusion. And this is very good because this is an illusion you can find everywhere today. People will say, just a matter of years until science has reached that point and we can map everything. It's not so much, I'm not criticizing the idea of science being able to map everything. What I'm looking at is rather the word everything. It's sort of, we tell from the beginning what the world is and we give it a limit. I would say that is a limitation in knowledge. I will not make a drawing of that limitation because then you would think about space directly. I'm now talking about knowledge. The very idea that the world is limited is in itself a limitation. And it has its history, and I think it's been going on since maybe even before the pre-Socratic. I think that is a trap that is easy to fall in, especially with the progression of modern day. I'll go in a bit to the text. I didn't have time to study the whole book, but I have an article here from Stephen M Rosen from 1997. And this article was published in the Journal of Mind and Behavior. We're talking about pages 391 to 423. And in this one, he sort of tried to explain in shorter terms, using a different approach, what is said in this book. And I think that is one of the keys for the understanding. You need to sort of approach the thing from different angles. In the end, you will find an angle that suits you as a person, your inclination. Because having just one approach in itself makes the idea of one thing stronger, one world, one explainable world. So having different approaches sort of soften that idea a little bit also. So it's two things that are good. Different approaches help you to understand better. And the second is different approaches also make it less likely that you will fall into the trap of an exhaustible world. Something that often was mentioned by Paul Feyerabend, who said that it could be the downfall of science to believe too much in that. And to a certain extent, without active training, he suggested propaganda to the scientist and common man to sort of stop that tendency, because it is incredibly limiting for our thinking. It makes us less lazy as well. I think it takes away that impetus that we need to be creative. And if we think the world is already out there, that's one bad thing. Then we add that the world is completely mappable, that you can sort of know every detail about it. Or even worse, I can imagine there's a scale here. And some people will claim by knowing maybe 1/10 of that world they already said is limited. That would be enough to sort of extract more or less accurate sketch of the world. You see the problems here? There are many traps to fall in, but I think this one is unusual. But if you fall into that trap, it's a bit depressing. And it will be a death to creativity as well. Let me go into the text. This essay, this is on the abstract, is written at the crossroads of intuitive holism as typified in Eastern thought, and the discursive reflectiveness more characteristic of the West. The point of departure is the age-old human need to overcome fragmentation and realize wholeness. 3 basic steps are set forth to provide some new insight into the underlying obstacle to wholeness. 2, to show what would be necessary for surmounting this blockage. And 3, to take a concrete step in that direction. At the outset, the question of paradox. Let me explain that a little bit. This is also a logical paradox. It has to do with logic, how we reason. We mentioned 2 lectures before about logos, rationality, how that came out of the cleavage from the world. You sort of disjuncted logos from mythos, and thereby creating logos, but also defining logos. What is logos? Logos, in its most superficial way, could then be what is not mythos. And this is very common today. Very common. I guess you all heard, is it a myth? Something that we see in media today, in books, in even articles. I found that this is a myth. And people are lazy then. They think it's completely enough to sort of uncover the myth, and then you're left with the truth. Something highly criticized by Edward de Bono, for instance. You don't make a discovery or an invention by taking away everything that is false. If I take this table, I can cut away everything that is not the statue of David. Then I will, in some miraculous manner, have David. It doesn't work that way. We can't cut away things and then make a thermos or a car or penicillin. This is the illusion that contradiction can actually, at a superficial level, create anything. But they give an image of sort of a very superficial knowledge. The paradox is here. We have a problem in language, and he will also take up the thinking of Heidegger. Wholeness is to be realized through paradox. So paradox is a sine qua non, an absolute predisposition to understand wholeness. And it is shown that a complete realization requires that the paradox be embodied. We need to have the paradox within us. It cannot be something out there only. Drawing from the fields of visual geometry and qualitative mathematics, 3 concrete models of paradox are offered: the Necke cube, the Möbius surface, and the Klein bottle. In attempting to model wholeness, an important limitation is recognized. A model is a symbolic representation that maintains the division between the reality represented and the act of symbolizing that reality. It is demonstrated that while the 2 first models are subject to this limitation, the Klein bottle, possessing higher dimensionality, can express wholeness more completely, provided that it is approached in a radically non-classical way. The final question of this essay concerns its own capability as an essay. It is asked whether the present text is restricted to affording a mere abstract reflection on wholeness, or whether wholeness can tangibly be delivered. And here is a quote here from Odysseus. He tarried at the threshold, he delays. He sets out with trepidation, clinging to her memory, leaves but does not. Odysseus does not know that his moment of departure will bring him home to her. From time immemorial, we human beings have sought to overcome the fragmentation in our lives and attain wholeness. What has been blocking the way? The I? What I mean is that the feeling of fullness, integrity, organic unity has eluded us. Not primarily because of an external obstacle separating us from it, but because whatever the explicit goal we have sought to attain, on an implicit level, the I, the ego, preemptively has asserted itself. And I would say in parenthesis here, this is the very problem of Plato, who searched for wholeness, and he wrote about his search for wholeness his whole life. And he became pretty bitter at the end by the wholeness or the understanding or reality had eluded him. He had entered into the cave that he himself constructed, and he went further and further down the corridors, and in the end he lost track of everything, including himself. Pre-consciously, or before the thing, before I can even begin to reflect on the contents on my thoughts, this sense of an I establishes itself and propels itself to the fore. This deeply ingrained sense of myself as an ego, an individual being whose inner core is segregated from the outer environment by a well-delineated boundary. And here early on already, Stephen M Rosen is mentioning something that is very hard to capture mentally. I think a trope here that is valuable is the voice of the friend from Derrida's Politics of Friendship. And he wrote really very clearly, eloquently, that the true voice of the friend is the voice of the friend that doesn't exclude plurality and thereby can show singularity, and vice versa. I think the tendency Stephen Rosen is pointing to here is if I sort of reify my I, my ego, and this is rather good. My point of view as a point, like in classical physics. And all of a sudden we have the old model, subject in front of space, with the object situated, located, and having a momentum, time. Something that Heisenberg showed to be impossible. This is the stagnate, this is not the pantarei, this is the stopping of the movement in one instant, trying to capture everything at once. The plight of Plato. Think about it this way, that my excluding my ego, my I from others will make, in parallel with the voice, my ego weaker. The voice gets weaker, more superficial, if it has the excluding tendency. I hereby proclaim singularity by excluding plurality. Instead, if the I can soften up and we can understand that my I rests on generations, millions of lives, millions of different egos, all of a sudden the I becomes stronger. There are millions behind you. And my personal I, my ego, just as shown here, does not exclude. Actually, it gets stronger the less it excludes. It gets more distinct the less it tries to push other things away. This is the construction of time, space, and knowledge. I know this is absolutely out there. I can comfort you with this is also quantum mechanics. This is also the saying of Heraclitus, but it is a tough nut to crack. But think about it also this way. I am quite certain that people of the past, take the Egyptians who constructed pyramids, they know that their lives would be very short, but they didn't focus on their own lives, their own ego. And even in modern terms, that sounds like giving up your own life, giving up your own position. According to Stephen M Rosen, it is not the case. It's just the opposite. And when I was reading history when I was very young in school, I often got the impression from the Middle Ages, from the Roman time, of a lot of plight. Yes, of course, on an objective level, but they were also including themselves constantly. Otherwise, how would it be possible to make those mega structures at that time? They didn't have building machines. And often when you read confessions, biographies, Bellum Gallia by Julius Caesar, that's like 40 years I read that, I think that's the title of the book, you constantly get the impression that that division between I and they, I and others, doesn't work in the same way. What Stephen M Rosen means, it makes the individual I stronger. It makes you an individual. It is the only possibility for you to have your own view, to put your foot down. It's actually not to exclude. Seeing your I also being massively underpinned and forced by all the eyes of history. That sense of communality or municipality or collective thought is not as collective as you think. It's actually the force of individuality. This is the voice that proclaims singularity or plurality without exclusion, which makes it strong, whereas exclusion makes it weaker, makes it fallible, and I would say the modern state of mind/body, it makes it impermanent. It is not the fire that burns forever. This is rather, as in the parable of Heraclitus, this is salt dissolving in water. This is the soul getting moist. And what does it mean by the soul getting moist? It means that it dissipates, disappears. Like a lump of salt you threw into the sea. First, the different fragments of the lump of salt would dissolve. It would still be visible like a wholeness, but now it's much weaker. The next step is that the very fragments, this is what he talks about, fragmentation, the grains of salt will also dissolve into water. They will disappear. And this is what happened in modern times. This is what Heraclitus warned us about. The disappearance of permanence. The disappearance of you being an individual. you becoming only das Man. And das Man doesn't really mean an I that conforms, like sort of bows to convention. I realize now that is not the exact meaning. It's more the dissolvement of myself, a partly voluntarily act to go into something that contains or consists of other dissolved human beings. This cleavage, embedded so deeply in every reflection, expresses itself in human language as the division of subject and object. Thus one says, I seek wholeness, and while the content of this assertion gives voice to a widely shared aim, its form, its underlying syntax, tacitly affects the fracture of the whole. There is an I and there is an it. The wholeness, that which, in fact, is a subverted wholeness. It is made, I would say, into definite article in Greek, a tha. A wholeness undermined by the very act of referring to it in this way. In so positing wholeness, one denies it, the same as this. Because here we map a whole world and we say it's mappable or limited in some sense. One denies it since such positing is an act that implicitly separates what is posited from the I who posits. Sorry about the tough syntax there. To be sure, all this is rather well known and has been an important focus of attention in spheres of discourse as disparate as existentialist philosophy, Heidegger, modernist literary theory and Zen Buddhism. But what has been done to address this problem of an I cut off from thou, from other, not merely by circumstance, by its innermost nature, an I which nonetheless, like the ever to be frustrated Sisyphus of Greek mythology, strives for wholeness. In spite of so much said by so many, are we not more estranged from one another today than we ever have been? At this juncture in human history, has our problem on fragmentation not reached critical proportions, as evidenced by widespread disorder on every level of human affairs, personal, social, national, international, planetary? Actually a quote from David Bohm, 1980. Must be his holographic paradigm. The free-fall purpose of this essay reflects the search for a meaningful response to our unmet need for wholeness. I hope to provide some new insight into the underlying obstacle to wholeness, to show what would be necessary for overcoming this blockage, and to attempt a concrete step in that direction. My exploration will begin by addressing the question of paradox, considered in relation to Zen meditation, the problem of language and the thinking of Heidegger. I will show that it is paradox through which wholeness may be realized, and that a complete realization requires that paradox be embodied. To that end, I will present several concrete models of paradox found in the fields of visual geometry and qualitative mathematics, but it is a model, not merely a symbolic representation of reality. It is an objectification of it that continues to be divided from the subject who symbolizes. In confronting this question, I will consider the crucial issue of dimensionality of the model. The final question of this essay concerns its own limitations as an essay. Are we restricted here to just talking about authentic wholeness, or is it possible to tangibly deliver it in this very text? We now go into the paradox of prajna. It's a famous Japanese philosopher, D.T. Suzuki, and he had identified something called the Northern School of Chinese Zen, and with a meditation technique called jhana. The aim is to go beyond the finite world of diversity given to the senses, gain awareness of a pristine, seamless totality by an act of self-transcendence. We attach ourselves to myriad things, people and particular ideas. Such fixation on the finite are what keep us in bondage. Why do we become thus fixated? Well, it's because of the limited and limiting sense we have of ourselves. It is the underlying feeling of incompleteness and vulnerability accompanying our experience of ourselves as finite that lead us to form attachments to other finite beings, as if these others could fill the hole in our universe, compensate us for our lack of sameness. Look at the Supplement by Derrida. Look at the idea of ideal objects in Plato. Look at the cogito ergo sum in Descartes. Look at modern philosophers who all strive for a wholeness they can never reach. Sometimes they even make a virtue of the possibility that wholeness is impossible, that reality is sort of made to torture us. Since the wholeness in question actually is not finite, the attachment form never serve the purpose for which they were truly intended. We don't even get happy with the finite things. The Northern School of Zen recommends a way out of this dilemma. We must practice meditation, polish the mirror of consciousness, gradually purifying our field of self-awareness through unrelenting training, when not a single blemish remains to cloud the reflection in the glass. We shall see into ourselves with impeccable clarity, see through to the truth of our infinite nature. With wholeness thus attained, all finite attachments will spontaneously fall away. However, on a subtle level, finitude evidently is still at work in this approach. The goal is set to transcend the boundaries of the self, make the transition from the boundedness to the boundless infinity, from division to wholeness, through the practice of meditation. The proponents of this method would be likely to add that in reality, self is not separated from the infinite totality, that the separation is only in one's mind, and that the purpose of meditation is to change one's mind. So we begin in a state of illusory boundedness and must move forward toward one of enlightenment and wholeness by means of the proper technique. But is not the mere assertion that self is not really separated from wholeness a linguistic abstraction? And are not these words contradicted by our actions when we treat wholeness as a goal which must gradually advance to by diligently following prescribed technique? To emphasize the need for technique to gain wholeness is to imply, in fact, we do not already possess it, at least not in a concrete way. It may be said that wholeness somehow lies behind, beneath the experience of finite selfhood, but in regarding the present actuality of self, its concrete manner of knowing, we do not project wholeness to potential state of future realization. There is a linguistic problem here. Any act of predication, any assertion that X is or that X is not, is an act. Look at this, this is grand. Saying that X is or X is not. Both these are limiting. If this is the is not and this is the is, there is a limitation, because all of a sudden you have this limitation. There is an interesting problem here. Implicitly, this is constructed, turning it into an object that is cast before the subjectivity of the predicator, that is an object in front of space, quite irrespective then of the explicit content of my thoughts or words. When the form of my discourse is that of predication, implicitly I finitize, objectify, create another, make limitation. Therefore, in predicating self, I actually produce what is other, what appears over against this existential self that predicates. The predication of infinite self is clearly no exception. The boundary pre-reflectively, before that is, drawn around it, lay down in advance, before, in advance of my conscious attention to its content, projects it beyond the concrete immediacy of its existential moment, thereby making it remote, something I might misguidedly seek to pursue by practicing the proper technique. In the case of Plato, it was the polishing of the senses, of the logos. Here we see how the goal-directed practice issues from a predicative discourse, sorry the complex language, and how applying said practice to attaining infinite wholeness undermines that attainment from the first. I sort of limit me before I even start by establishing this. And that will in the end be an exercise in futility, like Plato, Aristotle, or any other philosopher after Heraclitus. A predicated infinity must forever thereby remain beyond my reach, since to predicate is to finitize. So have a look-see at another approach here. That's called the Southern School. We talked about the Northern School now. And we are going now into the southern school of China, that is. In the southern school, the technique, which is no longer a technique per se, is to cease preoccupation with technique, to overcome, both in word and in deed, the idea of a circumscribed goal from which one is separated and must strive methodically to attain. Rather than rejecting outright the northern school emphasis on gradually polishing the mirror of consciousness, the advocates of the southern school portray the meditative experience as spontaneous and authentic when practiced in a form known as prajna. And that is the sudden realization that finite diversity and infinite totality, while being as different as they can be, nevertheless are one and the same. So you can fathom that as being the subject, going into the object, having a realization that it is a whole, but you're allowed to have that thought, you're allowed to have that attitude. At the same time, you can also have the attitude that that is not the case. Thereby, you're creating a paradox within the predication. Within the very goal you are trying to achieve, you both say to yourself, I will not achieve it, and you say also, I will achieve it. This is the southern school of avoiding the problem of fixation and making something that is infinite, which it is obviously, finite, and thereby hindering the development, the pantarei. And you can call this like a stop here in the tube. That's the simplest way of illustrating it. Think that there's a marble here getting stuck somehow. This is this stuckedness, this is this friction, this is something so obvious from many philosophers I read. You feel their frustration, you feel they're not getting anywhere. And sometimes they even write, I am completely at loss. Where am I supposed to go? It doesn't seem to be any progression, any direction. And I would say that is very accurate, because that is a problem with the classical model, and that is that all directions are the same. There is no proper up in the classical physics, because an up is always the opposite to a down. A left is always opposite to a right. Therefore, there are no direction. And hello and welcome to postmodernism. This is what the southern school is trying to avoid. And the state of today is that there are no truths, there is no true up, there is no true self, there is no soul, there is no free will. Can you see how the problem with trying to establish something leads to its very opposition? The critical step taken by the southern school is to embrace the paradox. At every turn, one must resist the temptation to fall back on the conventional mode of operation, that which presupposes the division of subject and object. Suzuki writes the following: all the logical and psychological pedestals which have been given to one are now swept from underneath one's feet, and one has nowhere to stand. This means that paradox is allowed to pervade, even and also in your own intention. I want to do it, I will not. It is through paradox that one challenges predication from within, rather than saying X is or X is not. One says X is not X. Is not X. Thereby you get everything, you get the wholeness. X is not X. Very important. And that is going to be your intention, and that will build up a strength that will surmount the obstacle of, from the beginning, saying or believing or intending that you got it all. So the very striving, this, I think mostly about Plato, how he strived his whole life, how he became so bitter, so disillusioned, and so hopelessly entangled in his own wishes. This is the way out of that. That you allow your own wish, your own intention, your own plan to be a paradox. I see it this way. You make your thinking be of the same nature as the Klein bottle, as space. Without, when I say nature, I don't want to give the sort of idea of substance. I say nature. Because if you have substance, you strive into the same problem. And this is no mere affirmation or denial of predicated content. That's also very important. This doesn't mean that you cannot predicate. It's just the opposite, I would say. This makes predication possible. This is the voice that speaks. It cannot speak. It cannot show plurality if it excludes singularity. It's absolutely impossible. Cannot happen. What you do is weaken your own position, and you also weaken your own voice. So nobody can hear it. You're weakening your own argument by using an imagined or real opponent. That's a weak argument. Feyerabend called that the straw man. If you try to show your own views by seeing them in contradiction to someone else's view. He said that is foolishness. That is weakness. That is lack of stamina. And I would say that is also lack of thinking. It's going the easy way. How easy is it not to just contradict? It's nothing to it. A child of 4 can do it. It can raise his arm and say, no, I will not. And I think this is what Plato is doing to some extent. Although he's a brilliant philosopher, I don't say he's completely gone. But his whole life project is of the child. It's childish. So in asserting that X is not X, the customary subject-predicate format is being used. X is the subject and is not X is the predicate. That's a way of getting around this. But in a manner in which the content this sentence expresses call the form into question at the same time. It is a questioning of the very syntactical role of these words, of the copula, of the stain, of the ousia. And it's done by means of a predicate. I think that's rather brilliant, and I think this is a very good time to end here. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant, well, still morning here. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.